Well, today's podcast of Small Town Big Arts is very special because for the first time, I'm going to draw the subject matter of today's podcast towards my own experience with my own organization, the Academy Center of the Arts in Lynchburg, Virginia. The aim of today's podcast is really to speak to how change can happen within an organization. And this can even happen when it seems that previous narratives or goals that wanted to be attained were unattainable, and how one can flip the script a bit and build momentum. Before we even started talking today, that came up a little bit, and I think we'll talk a bit about it today. So I'm really honored to have three guests with me today that were a part of the Academy Center of the Arts organizational change that took place over a number of years, but I entered the story in 2015, and these three incredible servant leaders were a part of helping our organization grow fourfold and build and restore an incredible historic theater in downtown Lynchburg, Virginia. So I'm joined by Sackett Wood, who grew up here in Lynchburg and attended East Glass High School, graduated from University of Virginia in 1987, and after working as a banker for 3 years in the Carolinas, came back to Lynchburg in 1990 and joined Moore & Giles as a salesman. He became president and CEO in 2007 and remains as the CEO today. He served on the Academy Center of the Arts board from 2011 to 2017, we think-ish.
Yep.
And was chair of the Academy Board of Trustees from 2015 through 2017. John Fees, formerly the executive chairman of BWX Technologies, served as chairman of the company starting in 2010, following its spinoff from McDermott International Incorporated. In 2015, Mr. Fees led the Babcock-Wilcox Company board through the spin out of its power generation business to create BWXT. Mr. Fees has brought experience in international markets concerning operations, engineering projects, energy, and product development. He has served on the boards of numerous community organizations here in Lynchburg, one of which was the Academy Center of the Arts, which he served on the board of from 2017 through 2020. George Dawson was the president and chief executive officer of Centra Health here in Lynchburg, Virginia, from 1987 to 2011. He served as the CEO of this nonprofit healthcare system since it was formed by the merger of the Virginia Baptist Hospital and Lynchburg General Hospital in 1987. At his retirement, Centra employed over 6,000 employees, had a medical staff of 400 physicians, and generated annual net revenues of approximately $650 million. After George's retirement, he led two critically important Lynchburg area nonprofit capital campaigns. The first was the Lynchburg Humane Society, followed by the Academy's Historic Theater Restoration Project. George served on the Academy board from 2015 through 2021. So really excited and honored to have you all here to reminisce a little bit, but also share, I think, some really important stories about how an organization can get a project like the Academy Historic Theater done. I want to start by first asking you all, each of you is highly respected community leaders in your own right and live here in Lynchburg, have been in Lynchburg for a long time, raised families here in Lynchburg. Why did this project matter to you? And I ask this question because I think it's important if somebody is running an organization, trying to start an organization that has a major capital project like this, it's really important to galvanize community leaders and human resource assets out in the community to get something done. And obviously, you being attracted to this project, wanting to be a part of it, was a big part of its success. So, Sackett, why don't we start with you? Why was this important to you?
Sure. Thanks, Jeff. It's really great to be here with all of you. It's been a while since we've all been together, so this is fun. It wasn't of interest to me until it was. The notion of the Academy had been drifting around Lynchburg for a long time, and there were a number of people who, including my father, who was involved, that were instrumental in sort of keeping the notion of it being restored in front of everybody. And I specifically remember I got a call in 2011 from Dave Petty, and a very respected lawyer in our community and very involved with the Academy. And I heard would you be interested in coming on to the And I knew it was going to be the Academy Board. And I began to think of every reason why I could not do this. and I started fumbling around a little bit. And, he's one of those guys that, if he asks you to do something, you sort of really need to consider it. And so he said, just come down and take a look at it with me, and we'll take a tour. And that was really, I think all of us would feel when we went into even this decrepit old building, you just sort of saw the majesty of it and the beauty of it and the potential of what it could be in the community. And so, the answer is yes. And I look back on it as really one of the more rewarding things I've ever done.
Well, and before we move on to John and George on this too, one thing I want to share is a little background on the theater itself. So the theater was originally built in 1905. It burned down in 1911, was rebuilt in 1912, and operated from 1912 to 1958. So this was a theater that sat vacant for 60 years on Main Street, and became a symbol of a lot of different things at different points in its life. But Sackett even speaking going into that space, and this is imagine a space that had been not occupied for 60 years. At one point had been even open to the elements. So just a bit of background there too. John, you want to share a little bit about why it mattered?
Well, to me, it's just the depth of what the Academy, as it has now been configured, represents to the community, because it isn't just a place to go see a show, or it isn't a place to go see visual arts or go see dance. It's all those things. And then you get down to the depth underneath there, and you got economic development, you've got education, you've got how we redeveloped that end of downtown Lynchburg. And so it was just this rich depth that it brought to the community, that the more and more I got involved in it, the more and more my mind got entrained in all the things that it can do. And so obviously restoring an old historic building has a certain appeal to it, and that certainly was a part of it. But the depth of everything that the Academy does was much more extensive than that. And so, when I was down there and we were doing the reconstruction, and you'd see the buses dropping the kids off from the local elementary school, and all the mothers there, and all the things, that doesn't necessarily get seen right up front as what the Academy is, but it's really in the depth of what it represents.
Yeah. George?
Yeah. Building on what John and Sackett have said, for me, it was like, okay, where do you want to live? And what's important? What things are important in the community that you call home? And for anybody who's going to be involved in fundraising, a deep connection to a cause or something that speaks to them is important. I can't imagine Lynchburg without a cultural and artistic center. And frankly, while the Fine Arts Center had merged with the Historic Theater, that was in question before the Academy project really was done. Whether we would be a center that really, a community that really had an arts center, or whether that would be splintered and kind of fragmented and not really part of our community life. So not only was it a downtown project, but it was also speaking to how we saw ourselves, what communities we wanted to be like, what was important to us, and connecting the donor base with that vision that I think was part of the cultural change, Jeff, that you've alluded to.
Yeah, and we'll definitely talk. I would definitely want to get into that and talk about that. George referenced a merger, so the Lynchburg had the Lynchburg Fine Arts Center, which was the art center for the city, which existed from 1962 until its closure in 2003. And we are right now actually celebrating the 60th anniversary of it. My organization's 501c3 is actually the Lynchburg Fine Arts Center's 501c3. So it was a merger that occurred prior to the project happening, that was with a merger of an organization that was working to restore this historic theater, and then an organization that was the Community Arts Center for the city. So these two entities came together then to basically create a downtown arts complex. And it took a number of years to get there. And with that came, to have the Lynchburg Fine Arts Center, which was, meaningful to a lot of people in the community, in lots of different ways. To have that go away was painful for a lot of people, and it was the start of the story. And for some, the start of the story is, there's lots of starts. The story of the theater is really complex. But I think about storytelling a lot, and I think about the identity of the organization, the brand of the organization. And one of the things that I noted that was really, really critical in the beginning of the change, the flip of the switch, where the project became something which, in the narrative in the community, if you can imagine, this capital campaign project went on for 20 years. So there was an ongoing narrative that this wasn't possible. So the story really had to change because people had really become accustomed to this idea that that it was crazy. This was crazy. I heard that a lot, or it wasn't feasible. Lynchburg couldn't get it done. It wasn't something we could handle. And so the brand, the identity, the story that was told had to be changed. And each of you were really critical in that. So I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about the changing of the narrative. And we can go in lots of different directions here, but I think what you all brought, and if we're sort of talking to other organizations, other organizational leaders, each of you, and I'll say this because you may not, but each of you brought credibility to the project. And that was really important. And I would sort of say to listeners that, that is really important, right? That people trust what you're doing and that it's possible and it can happen. And there's lots of ways that trust is established or that people believe in a narrative. But what if we could talk, it could be a little bit of a reflection of what once was, what needed to happen to make that possible. But if we could discuss that a little bit.
Jeff, before we started the public campaign, we had a private campaign going on, and it was all about the credibility of the past failures. And so everybody we talked to, they said, as a community, we really want to do it. We're still highly interested in it. But, if I commit to anything, I'm going to have a long list of contingencies because of what's happened in the past. And everybody wanted to be the last person to put a dollar on the table at that particular point in time.
Yeah.
And so, I think it was the reformulation of the management team, the board, creating a cogent story about where we were going. But fundamentally after that, delivering on it and delivering on the milestones going forward. And that, are we going to raise the money? Are we going to get enough money? Is the city going to get behind it? Do we have a good architectural plan? Do we have a good cost estimate? And all those things. And we had to keep on delivering that back to the community and telling the community, yes, we did that. Yes, we accomplished that. Yes, we're going to make that next step. And we really had to build that credibility. And it was a tremendous cultural change in terms of how the community looked back at the academy.
And I'll share it actually internally did too. I think to this day, we're celebrating 4 years since the theater opened. To this day, we have this sort of sense of like we have to be transparent, we have to be credible, we have to back everything up, But George.
Yeah, a little bit about that early history too might be helpful to your listeners. So there had been at least 3 or 4 kind of eras in which funds had been raised with this vision in mind. I know early on, right after the merger, the early leaders were successful in raising some money and actually saving the theater in one sense. That those early donations, when a windstorm ripped the top off the fly tower, they were able to put a new roof on and save it and prop up a wall. But also, during other periods, some of that money had been spent that had been pledged for capital had been spent on operations, or there were some elaborate shows that everybody wasn't quite sure where the money came from and where it went, and there were different eras. So that was that history to overcome that, John, you were talking about. Yeah. The other thing I would say was important was the leveraging the interest, but also the credibility. So I remember distinctly that when I got involved, I didn't know it at the time, but I found out soon that John and Sackett and a few other community leaders had been sort of quietly and anonymously discussing with each other would pledges be made and how much can be raised. So we took those early contingent commitments that, John, you spoke about, I think $3 million in total. Yeah. But when we approached the city to match some downtown money, part of the story was we've already got a head start. and that gave some level of confidence. We also did a whole lot of elaborate economic feasibility studies and I remember calculating the tax benefit and how many tickets we had to sell and how much revenue.
I remember that.
I do
all
too.
that. And then individually calling on members of city council to try to gin up support. So all of a sudden we had this quiet group of donors who were still in the background, but had raised 2 or 3 million. We had the city coming in for 2 or 3. And we had some early gifts that we had inherited from a campaign of 4 or 5. So with an $18 million or $16 million goal to start with, I think we raised 18 in the long run. But all of a sudden we had, close to half of it. So people began to believe.
Well, let me take you a little farther back because I have vivid memories. When I started in 2011, I mean, we were just scraping along just to keep the lights on for a while. And I then became in charge of the corporate effort. And I distinctly remember we had made even our company had made a very small commitment. And I started calling on these companies, and I went and asked one of these companies for a large commitment. And he asked me how much I'd committed. And I said I was still thinking about it. And he said, well, come back to me when you've thought about it. And we immediately then made our commitment and then led with that and went back to them, and they made their commitment. Anyway, long story short, we started having marginal success at the corporate level. I mean, when I say marginal, we probably raised close to $1 million. But it was still so far out of sight. But John won't remember this, but I do. You probably will remember it. But I was doing this corporate effort, and John Fees and Lynch Christian called me and said, "We know you're down at the academy. Why don't you come meet with us?" And I didn't know either one at the time, but I went and sat with them at the at John's dining room table, and they began to tell me about this group that they were cultivating, and really encouraged me to just keep going. And we're going to try and come in behind with support. And I just remember it was the day that I thought, okay, maybe there's a chance here. And so that what they just said did come to fruition. And then John joined the board in 2017.
Yeah, about there.
Right, somewhere.
Yeah.
But
I can't remember what I had for breakfast.
So I have
Sorry.
vivid memories of
Sorry.
both of you, the interaction of you coming onto the board. And John, I called you because somebody told me that you won't be able to get John to join the board. And I said, well, just call him. All he can say is no. And John answered the phone, and he was in like Copenhagen or somewhere. And I just asked him, would you consider joining the board? Just say you'll consider it. And he said, I'll consider it. And then he came back and joined the board. And then George Dawson called me, and I was in New York City on a business trip. And this is before you had been asked to join the board. And George asked me, do you think we can do this? And I paused, and I didn't know what to say because it was such a big, leap. And I said, George, I've taken a leap of faith on this. And he said, I got it. That's good enough. And but I say all this because really these two gentlemen had the trust and credibility of the community and could stand up in front of the community and talk about these kinds of dollars that were needed in a way that people listened to.
Well, I'll share my own personal story in taking the job. It was you. We had some conversation, and I was like, because I had been back in Lynchburg. I grew up in the area and came back, and I'd been back for a bit of years, and I had been drawn into the narrative too. I was like, this is a disaster. This isn't going to happen. And you told me, you were like, we're going to get this done. Like, we're going to get this done. And I remember you saying that to me. I was like, okay, well, if Zach is saying that this can get done, then I think maybe I can do this. And I was leaving a tenured track position and the sort of safety of it. And so I think with this, I want to, so also for context for our listeners. So we were, the project all in all was a $30 million project, but some of that had already been done. The fly tower had been built. But the dollar amount we were trying to raise at that time was 18.5 million. Is that right, George?
Yeah, I think the initial fundraising goal, which included the 3 million from the city and related parties. I think to start with, it was 16.7, and it ended up raising about 18.7.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and then tax credits were on top of that. We'll talk about
That's a
that
whole
later.
nother story.
Yeah, that's going to be in part 2. There are 2
Yeah.
parts to this podcast series too. We're going to do part 2, and we talk about the construction project. We're definitely getting into detail about that. So,
Jeff, I
yeah.
want to jump in and picking up on Sackett before we drop that thread and John's comments. So this idea of leveraging was interesting and important because my involvement with the fundraising, I had briefly been on the board for a year or two earlier, got off the board when your predecessor left and the then board chair took over kind of as an interim. We talked and he asked me if I wanted to get involved from a fundraising standpoint. And I said, well, before I answer that, I want to do my due diligence. And I actually I said, I need 45 days. And I said, here's what I want to see. I want to see your financials. I want to see audited financial statements. I want to see the construction plan. I want to find out how much money has been raised and what commitments have been made. So I sort of was trying to decide, am I willing to put my name on the line? And going through that, the first thing I saw was something, John, you mentioned, how solid the architectural planning and cost estimates were. Part of the previous story had been that cost estimates never were accurate. And so there had been a lot of work done with not only the architects, but also with a construction firm to kind of detail cost. And then, the fundraising history was not great, but there were good prospects and you had a good staff. You had, the Academy had a development director, Beth Dole, who I thought I would have support from. And plus I was looking for something. I'd recently retired and needed something to do. That helped too. So,
well, yeah. And I will say, we're talking to folks too, and who's in your community, right? Who has expertise that could be helpful to you, who has credibility, and retirement. Those who have retired are
capacity,
have a lot of capacity and should be remembered when we're looking for folks to help. John, before we got started, you had mentioned how important momentum was, and that seems to be kind of a part of what we're talking about. Meeting with people and making a little bit of headway, and then going ahead and committing your own business and using that to get a little bit more, and then understanding the city needed to feel that it was feasible before they were going to put their political weight behind it. So I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the momentum building that was necessary, because it felt that way. It felt like something was was rising up, right? And we felt it internally, but we also felt it externally. And I wonder if we could just kind of talk about maybe critical steps that you remember, because we've sort of started the story a little bit in that, other critical moments that happened that were important in that momentum building.
Well, like when we made the public announcement down in the Warehouse Theater about the fact that we had the 3 million in hand, and then we followed that up with George getting on board, and then we had some other announcements about where we were on the fundraising, and I think that we started to create a sense of momentum. But the thing that we had to do is we had to feed the momentum by coming back and continuing to put the story back on the table and say, this is where we are, this is where we're heading, this is the next step. Oh, we accomplished that step. Oh, we signed the construction contract. We broke ground today. Here's what it's going to look like. And we kept on feeding that momentum. And that allowed us, I remember distinctly sitting in a board meeting and Sackett turned around and we were a little bit concerned about, overruns and are we going to be able to cover any overruns that might happen? And Sackett said, let's raise $1 million. And we went off and we raised $1 million because, we had this credibility and we had this momentum that we could go back into the donor base and we could say, we need a little bit of a cushion here. And we were able to get that cushion. And that allowed us to continue to go forward. And I think that that it was not just the sense of momentum, but it was the fact that our actions fed the momentum and allowed us to be able to continue to make that kind of progress. And and again, I think it's all about credibility of action. I mean, and we were able to just continue to take the thing forward.
Another part of that, from a fundraising standpoint, is sort of the importance of having a solid plan for how you're going to raise the money, and that you have built a solid pyramid. I know that's sort of old fashioned. I always talk about that, but in this day and time, a lot of people say, "Well, let's have a campaign. Let's have a party. Let's have a band. We'll all contribute. It'll get done." Well, that doesn't work out. We ended up having something like 1,400 or 500 individual gifts in the end to this campaign. But to start with, we had to have the big gifts, and we had to have, we had to raise enough money on the front end to fill in the top of the pyramid before other people were willing to come on board in the broad community. At the end of the day, we ask everybody in the community to give. But we had that quiet period that we talked about, and then when we went public, we had enough money that people could see this happening. So to start with, everybody was saying, "Oh, this is a pipe dream. We've heard it before. It'll never happen." At some point, almost overnight, people were saying, "I better get on board. This train's pulling out."
Right, I'm going to miss the train.
So I was going to say the same thing. The word pipe dream, the word I got many times was boondoggle. So this is a boondoggle. This is too much money that this community can raise, and they would rightfully say, we want to contribute in the community, but we have limited resources, so we have to be very thoughtful about how we allocate these resources, which I get. But to George's point, that momentum, that boondoggle turned into a real project within a year or less. And I just remember going back to some of the same folks who said, "This is a boondoggle," and said, "We're in. We like what you're doing." And I think it's just a reminder to keep going. The stars sort of aligned really quickly, just through sheer perseverance, I think. So.
And credibility.
Yeah.
And the foundation of having the budget, the architectural plans, in this case, because it was a building, having the engineering estimates, all added to that credibility. Rob Taylor's not here today, but it put an important part Rob has.
No question.
On the leadership.
And he'll be on the next broadcast, actually.
Okay. So,
and there was a break point too that you could feel that, to what Sackett was saying, is there was a time when people were saying, "Hey, this is among the largest, or maybe the largest thing we've ever done as a community." And there was a break point where all of a sudden it became affordable. Everybody says that, we can invest in this, and we can afford to do this. And it you just kind of felt it when it happened, because then all of a sudden you, as others have indicated here, you would go and you'd start talking to people, and they would be, "I'm going to make a contribution. I'm going to get on board with this. I want to become a part." And that was not easy to get early on, because people didn't think that it was affordable for Lynchburg. And it just shows you that you really can do a whole lot more than maybe your limitations in your mind have about how far you can take something like this.
Yeah.
But tied into that, John, one of the things that I think propelled it, in fact, Jeff, is the idea that the Academy was more than just a historic theater, and frankly, more than just a downtown arts organization. It's the center of our arts and our cultural part of our community. But it also was important downtown revitalization effort.
Mm-hmm.
And it also connected a lot of diverse groups in our community, diverse racially, economically, but also politically. And all of a sudden, those groups were all working together to make something happen that today, when you look at the theater and the performance schedule, and you see those different groups involved today. And so, one of my thoughts is, I can't imagine when we needed a time to bring people together of different thoughts and ideas more than we do right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would just add, Jeff, because I know you won't be able to say it, but the right leaders also fell in behind the right leader, and having Jeff come on board in 2015 was just crucial, and just the right time, the right man at the right time. And you know, while we're doing all this fundraising, Jeff comes on board. It's safe to say now that we were completely broke operation.
Yeah. Yeah.
And and you know, there's so many chapters of this story, and one I'll share when Jeff came on board is that Roger Faulber, he probably wouldn't want me to mention his name, but he came to me, and he's been a long time dedicated person to this project. Was not on the board at the time, but we were maxed out on our lines of credit completely. I mean, completely tapped out, and that was a little stressful. I think I just become the board chair, and he said, "You guys keep going, and we'll raise the money to pay off these lines of credit." And he did. I mean, he did it very humbly, and it happened. It was
such a
huge
gift.
lift.
It was such a gift.
Huge lift.
Wow.
So
And it allowed us, I will share too, just for the audience, and what it gave us too, and we keep talking about credibility, we could go to people and be like, we're not in debt,
Right.
and that, was another brick in the credibility wall.
Yeah. Will the organization even be here? Yeah,
Right.
Right. A year from now.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
yeah.
And it was a big gift. And I'll share, we just talk about momentum, now 4 years after the project was completed, that momentum actually carried us forward too. So the institution, the organization kind of rode that wave. And there were lots of things I will share for people who are looking at a project like this and wondering about the sustainability or the viability of the organization afterwards. Because we got a lot of questions about that. Okay, we put all this money, we build this thing, and then is this going to be a sustainable, viable project? I think that it propelled us forward. It gave us a story. It gave us a narrative. It gave us credibility, as was mentioned earlier, in regards to continual fundraising that we've had, the business community believing in it, engaging with it every year, audiences attending. I think, George was talking about the audiences themselves and who the audiences are, and that still took time, to create and build a diverse audience base. But we also felt accountable to the same accountability that the architecture had, that the construction project had, that the tax credit process had. We as an institution felt, well, if this was the narrative we told, right? If City Hall is going to give us $3.5 million, we better come through on living up to what this is that we said we would be. And so I think the project itself also in a way led to a viable organization, and the lessons that we learned as an organization, observing what you all were doing and building that momentum and that credibility and what would be asked of us if we built that thing, was instilled in the organization as the organization grew to match what was being built.
Yeah.
And the building remains an inspiration to us, right? We walk into it, and I don't know if you all feel this when you come back in that building, but I mean, Zach was talking about going in there for the first time, and it just, I mean, the idea that it went from what it was.
So, Jeff, what I hear you saying is that for the staff and the people engaged in the day-to-day operations, it's an idea of living up to the promises.
Yes.
Right? Keeping the promise and living up to that, and that's a key element. Yeah.
And it's a symbol of what is possible too. I think when you kind of think, oh, I can't do this, it's not possible, we can't do it, you're like, it actually is. Like, you saw this thing go from something absolutely down in the doldrums to this thing that is absolutely a beautiful gem in the city and a symbol,
And I don't want to misspeak, because for me, at least, every day until opening night that December was a stressful day.
yeah.
Oh yeah.
I mean, it was, we even though you saw this break in momentum, this affordability thing come up, it was always stressful. Are we going to make that happen? Oh, we've got this issue with the construction. Oh, the architect's saying this, and are we going to get through the debt? Or are we going to get the tax credits? Are they going to get sold in the right? Every day was a stressful day until we finally opened that curtain, and I was sitting there, and so it was, even though we made fundamental changes, even though we had great progress, there was never a lack of a stressful day all the way to the end.
Yeah.
No question.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the tax credits will be in the next one, but that.
Yeah. Well, and we're alluding to that a little bit. So there, we'll be, in the second part of this podcast will be George Zippel will be one of our guests, and George was one of the board members, volunteer leaders who led the tax credit side of the project, which was 8 million.
9.5.
Yeah. I've still got George's notes on my phone. Rehabilitation expense and tax credit.
Yeah.
You must have a lot of memory on your phone.
I do.
But I think I think the galvanization around the project community wide. But I do want to in thinking about an audience that is in a smaller community, nonprofit arts organizations. I also observed, and each of you were a critical part of this. I also observed a culture shift in the board from the point that I came on to the point that the theater opened. And I wonder if we could talk a little bit about that. And second, I know that there was work happening on that before I even got there. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about, that what the board needed to be, both to get the project done, but also to live up to the promise of the project once it was completed.
Yeah, so we were really stopping and starting, and really just, for a few years there, we're just keeping, again, this notion of it alive without real momentum. And then there was a fundraising effort before you came, which was nobody was aligned with. Everything happened for a reason in this project. And we said we don't want to start fundraising yet because we don't have a lead gift. And the decision was made to start it, and it was, nobody agreed with it. But what did result out of that is the marquee. And I don't know if you all remember, but the marquee, we raised money to build a marquee so that we could show this visible symbol on Main Street of the possibility of this theater. And it was a small crowd that came on the opening. This was before your time, and it was powerful. I mean, a lot of the right people were there that sort of saw this as a symbol. That being said, just strategically choosing and getting the right people involved at the right time, it just made a big difference. I mean, George is very humble. I mean, we didn't go ask the city for money. We went because of George's work and made the business case to the city for the money. What is the return going to be for them? And I mean, he did an extensive amount of work on that. And so, but again, that's when things really, once they were on board, these things started rolling. So.
One other thing in the culture of the board, Jeff, because when I wasn't on the board until I became involved and then sat on the board, but internally there was a reset on the operational financial management, control, and reporting. And there was a complete change in culture. And I feel like that the board had more responsibility, had more knowledge, and all of a sudden had to confront the operational financial issues, which without a successful operating budget, you can have the best theater in the world, but you're not going to keep the doors open. Right. Or you can have the best arts organization. And so I think the board stepped up in filling that role of its day-to-day, and that allowed us to then make credible promises to donors and to other funding sources that we could not have made without that. So kind of for other organizations, kind of blocking and tackling, but do you have a good operating budget? Do you know how much money comes in, goes out? Do you know where it gets spent? Do you have approval processes? Do you have good audits? Do you have, and that's important.
Yeah, pushing for that. I mean, I that was a horrible period.
Remember the whole reset of the whole accounting program?
My God.
Yeah.
I still have nightmares about that. But it was really a horrible time. But I think the point being it being a horrible time was it was absolutely necessary. The board pushed for accountability from the staff. And that was really important. The board did feel responsible, and then also put people in place from the board to help support that happening. I remember Ted Dahlheim, who I believe, John, you recruited to the board.
Yeah.
Ted was critical in that time in sitting down and patiently walking through with us and supporting us through this. It was really like a surgical procedure. I mean, it was awful.
So here's the for others. Here's the take of our artistic and creative and visionary leader Jeff for reacting to the nuts and bolts of accounting and debits and credits and the CPAs on the board. So
I mean, it was a great learning moment. But again, we needed the board's expertise to get us through it, but also to push us to not sort of accept mediocrity or really, anything less than transparency. And that transparency carried over later. I mean, we still have very transparent conversations internally in the organization, even when they're not fun conversations to be had. So,
but the board really rolled up its sleeve and worked. That was real key too. I mean, all the committees of the board were very active. We used to have the executive committee meetings, the breakfast meetings on Main Street in between board meetings. It wasn't like we all came to a monthly or a bi-monthly board meeting or something like that and sat there, listened to a presentation and went home. It wasn't like that at all. I mean, we were working this all the time, whether we be in committee or board or executive committee, there was dialogue going on all the time about what we were doing.
But in addition to that, and with that, it was also fun.
It was fun.
Yeah,
I was going to say the same thing.
You got to make it fun for the people doing the work. We don't want to. This was not drudgery. This was.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't easy, but it was also fun.
Well, let me say, I remember those breakfast meetings well, and what I remember most of is that you had with George and John, and then George Zippel and Rob Taylor, either former or current president CEOs of some of the major companies in town, and we met every week for a while there. And I just remember being so impressed because there was lots of problems. I mean, and there was never one disagreement, never one argument. It was like, okay, how do we fix the problem? And we just stayed with it. And it was for me, a real learning experience of what teamwork really does look like. And Jeff, I think you've got to also remember, from the board standpoint, you also rebuilt the organization internally, with the right people in the right seats, and there was a lot of exhaustion coming to this, and so that put a lot of energy into the organization at that time.
Well, the group was really fatigued when I came in, and so I think they were almost a reflection of the community itself and the board itself.
Yeah.
Right? Everyone was just really tired, from sort of failed attempts in the past, and belief had to be built up there too, and so this has been. So I'm kind of curious. I have a few questions here, and I'm kind of curious about this one because this probably could send us in a lot of directions. But if you could, and I'll get, if you could do it again, is there anything you would change in the process and the work that was done? Kind of curious about that.
Just starting over, I would, knowing what I know now, I would really sit down with, if I was the board chair, and sit down with each member of the board and ask them if they had the energy and for this and the commitment that it's going to take, because it took a lot of time, and so I just think again getting the right composition of the board is very important as you tackle this.
Yeah, it's almost like thinking about this earlier when you were talking about the board. One of the things I noticed too, it's almost like building a sports team. There was, specific skills that were needed, adding those people, but some of that is also mentality, right? And that's really critical.
I can't think of anything that I would have really changed. I think that we did the right things at many steps along the way. We made a few mistakes here and there, but they were not critical. They were not material mistakes that really set us back and put us in a position where we couldn't deliver on the promises. So I guess, just reflecting on it, I'm not sure I'd really change a whole lot.
Do you feel like we knew at the time when those mistakes were happening that they were critical or not?
Not always, not always. But, but again, we were working very hard and we just put our head down and just plowed through it. And, I remember one conversation we had about accounting, about how do we allocate cost relative to capital startup versus non-capital startup, and can we capitalize some of that, not capitalize that? What does that mean in terms of the funding? And we were sort of sitting there looking at that problem. We weren't sure it was going to turn out right. And we ended up working the problem, and it turned out fine.
One thing that I'm thankful for, we all should be, is that that on the front end we did know what all the problems were. Because we might never have tried.
So true.
And so I'm saying I don't know. I think our greatest strength. You've given us a lot of credit for how competent we were. I think the greatest strength might have been what we didn't know, and
We
then
might not have done it.
Yeah, well, and it's
So being naive was a real critical asset.
well, I mean, the fact that we couldn't face every problem all at once, but we faced them in turn and worked through them. So and our work's not done. We got the endowment we were talking about. It's not only building this thing, but then how do you make sure you've at some point any capital structure you need to fund depreciation. You need to replace those heating, cooling systems, and
It doesn't stop.
Replace the curtains and the carpet and everything else. So
that was one of the fears early on, is that we're going to go ahead and build this really great complex, and we raised the money to build it. Are we going to be able to continue to plow the energy into it to make it sustainable long term for the future? And as you all remember, we were getting the tar beat out of us along the way with bad roofs and boilers blowing up and all that. And we were really, it was one point through the middle of this whole development, we were scraping for money just trying to fix all the old stuff and keep the whole thing going. And it was a little scary there for a few minutes.
Well, how about I'm not sure when this was, but at some point we had the lobby was going to be on the right side of the building.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the old gas
we came
stove.
to that meeting with you and Lynch and George and Roger Fowler, and we realized we couldn't afford to do it. I mean, so we had to, right in a day, switch it to the left side of the building. And I think anybody that goes into the theater now cannot imagine the lobby not being where it is now. So
That's
just
right.
fate sort of played its hand on a few things.
Yeah. So for a little context for your listeners, of course, the Academy Center of the Arts is a block and a half downtown, and incorporates the historic theater we've been talking about, but also a separate warehouse theater and a attached building that houses galleries and pottery studios and administrative space. So while we were restoring one place, we had to then maintain the other places, which had been neglected due to funding promises. So one quick shifting a little bit is the other thought broadly, Jeff, is sort of the thinking about your listeners. So there is the scarcity mentality that, okay, there's not enough money in this community to fund this. If we do this, how's it going to affect early childhood education or, the Humane Society or whatever it might be. But then there's also the abundance mentality. And at least in our community, and I'm guessing in a lot of other communities, the resources are there if the connection and the credibility to what's important can be made. And there's only scarcity when there's scarcity of the relevance of the project to the people.
Yeah.
But if you can make that connection, then all of a sudden there are untold resources. And I think there are, stories we know where had we reached people earlier, there would have been a larger gift made than there was, and we missed one. But there are also stories now where, because we are highly relevant, we're planting seeds for the future that I hope will help that endowment and other things. So I would say to your listeners that you got to make that connection, but don't sell your community short.
I love that, because one of the themes that kept coming up in previous episodes was value, right? And the organizations that I was speaking to were success stories in small communities, and they were providing clear value, right, that the community understood and could feel, and therefore they were viable because of that, right? And so that is right in line with a lot of what I keep hearing over and over again in the interviews.
Jeff, let me turn it to you for a minute, because when you came on board as executive director, we'll all remember that the name of the academy, which you can't even remember now, was the Academy of Fine Arts.
Yeah.
And so with all that was going on, Jeff comes in and says, I want to rebrand the company. And I'm like, oh my goodness. But talk about that a little bit, because I think that was a
Yeah.
crucial move and a very, very wise one. So.
Well, I always personally hated the name, so it always bothered me. Even before I was with the organization, I just thought it was a silly name. I understood why it existed, and if Mike Gillette is listening, Mike, forgive me. The idea was fine. It was that there was the combination of the Academy of Music Theater and the Lynchburg Fine Arts Center. I just felt that the most important word was left out. It was a center, and I thought it was really important that the name was descriptive of what it actually was. Just practically, so people understood what it was when they drove by it, or they saw it, or or they read about it. But also for us to sort of understand what our purpose was, that we were there to bring people together to gather in space, and a center does that. And that was what I thought was most important about the Lynchburg Fine Arts Center, was that it was a center. And we were missing that. And there was something also about Academy of Fine Arts that felt,
Exclusive.
Fine.
Yeah.
Fine. It felt fine.
Yeah. Yeah. I wasn't a fan of the word, and on lots of levels, all kinds of directions it could go in. But I think branding, is really important. And I think I will say too, I think that Moore and Giles being so, the company that Sackett runs, is a high-end leather company, and your identity and your brand, right, is so strong and such a part of how the company presents itself and rolls out. So I also think that was very influential at that time too. We had access to your team. I remember your team rebuilt our website. We had this marketing company that was great. And so I share that too, I think, to listeners, is remember these assets, these board members, right? Now granted, that was really generous, but it was also extremely influential. I want to share one story, because we're kind of coming close to the end. And I just want to share this story because I was thinking about it while we were talking. We were talking about momentum building and community building. And George, this thing happened that has always stayed with me. And it was such a powerful lesson. George met with every single member of City Council. City Council is made up of 7 members. And there was one member of council we were pretty positive was not going to vote for this, just due his previous political record and where he could have stood on many public projects. So we were, one could easily be like, oh, it's, forget about him. It's lost cause. Don't do it. Right. We don't have a lot of time. And I remember, George, you went into our conference room with this particular council member and spent I felt like it was 2 hours with him.
Yeah.
And it was such a powerful lesson. And the result was not that the council member voted for it. He did not. But the result was that he didn't put up a stink about it.
Yeah.
And it was such a powerful moment to see the importance of that conversation, and it was, I will always carry it with me as a leader. That was just really powerful, and was worth it. Was absolutely worth that time, because it could have been a big stink, and there could have been arguments on the council floor, and there wasn't.
It was not. It was a very good dialogue we had with City Council when we presented.
And just I share that too. I think there can be political pushback in a community, and I think it's important to draw everybody into a dialogue as much as you can, because even if they don't vote for it or they don't come on your team necessarily, they also might not fight you, and that can be just as helpful.
Yeah, and in the process, you might learn something that you wouldn't have learned before that you can apply to somebody else in the community, to a different segment. Our theater serves a lot of different groups, and I think that's a good thing. And in this community right now, what was we had some line we said we were at the intersection of Martin Luther King Avenue and Main Street and Rivermont Avenue. And
the bridge to Amherst County.
In the bridge to Amherst County. Yeah. We were at this crossroads, and our organization was at a crossroads, and so was the town, and we could be an element to bring us together.
Yeah.
Having a quick, convincing elevator speech that was in line with the true mission of the organization and the true direction was an important part of that early communication.
But in addition to that, the organization delivered on the promise, because when you go to a show or you go to an event or you go to the gala or you go to these things, it's just not a bunch of old white people with white hair like me. I mean, you see a great diversity in the audience and the people that are there. They're all involved in the mission, and that was a purposeful thing that was done, and it got accomplished. And so it wasn't just a billboard; it just wasn't a slogan.
Yeah,
It became the
right.
reality of what the organization became.
And so does the performance schedule. If you look, I mean, we might
Right.
we may be hosting a religious Christmas concert, and we might be hosting I don't know,
The drag brunch.
the drag queens of Lynchburg next week. So, yeah, I don't know.
I don't think they're
It
coming
works.
from
Yeah,
Lynchburg,
okay.
actually,
Yeah, but okay.
but they're still there. Yeah, it's
And you see it in the arts programs. You see it in the pottery studio. You see it in the the kids,
Children's.
the children that come from the schools and try to compose music and
Yeah.
all that stuff. You see it in everything.
well, and I think to maybe bring it all the way around, it's interesting when I do these podcasts, sort of what I walk away with. And one of the big things from this is the importance of momentum. We've talked a lot about that, but also accountability, right? I think that the board got stronger because it was accountable to itself. It was accountable to the staff and the team. In turn, the staff and the team were accountable to the board, which was connected
Yeah,
back to the wider
right.
community. And that accountability remains. We said we would be a center for everybody we possibly could be, and that's what we say too. If we do an event that people don't like, right? If there's a religious event in the space and they don't like it, or there's a drag brunch and they don't like it, the response always is that we're this is part of our value statement, is that we're here for everybody, and that's what we said we would be. And so
And to your listeners too, we should probably be explicit in saying that when the theater closed in 1958, it was completely segregated.
Yeah.
It had an upstairs balcony with a separate outside entrance, and in our reopening, we celebrated how far we'd come, but we didn't cover up that period. And even today, I think that's also part, and we should recognize that.
Yeah.
This is
and it's a continued journey for us. It's not over, right? But we recognize that would be another barrier to people's belief or connectivity to us if that remains sort of out there. And so and it continues to be something we work on. We're certainly we have a diversity of audience, but it can be even more. We can be drawing more people in. It's part business also, honestly. You sell more tickets, the more people you connect to. So
opening night, we had a very diverse opening really week, but I remember so much, sort of the different groups, the gospel choirs, the two board members performing together.
yeah, it was an exciting time. Well, I the organization is forever indebted to you all. The community is too, because we have this incredible asset. And in an earlier podcast, I had spoken to a colleague of mine in Alaska, and he runs an organization that took over a college that closed down, college campus, and the campus for this town in Sitka, Alaska, had become kind of a symbol of the decline of the community because it had been abandoned and left, and they took it over, and they one building by building they built it back, and it became a symbol that the community was thriving, that it was coming back again. And that theater becomes a symbol of what's possible. We hear all the time when people come in there, they're just like, oh my God, this is amazing. I'm in Lynchburg, I'm transported. This is phenomenal. And I think even even at the start of the conversation talking about why this is important, right, is that, George was talking about it being a symbol of what a community cares about, what it invests in. And we're just so, fortunate that you all spent the time and the energy that you did to dedicate your expertise and honestly, your credibility. I want to thank you for that too.
Well, I think we all enjoyed it. One thing I'd like to, are we, is George and Rob separate?
Yes.
So I want to say one thing for George, because John and Rob delivered the building, on time and on budget. George delivered the fundraising, to the penny. Everything came aligned, but the unsung hero of the project was George Zippel. And
Yeah.
everybody thinks these projects you can go get tax credits and they're available. Yeah, they're available, but that is a job in itself. And, also he delivered on time and at the last possible minute what I call not just the best tax credit deal in America, but the only tax credit deal in America at the time. It seemed like, because it was hard, and it was a language. I rode with him to a lot of places, and a language you had to learn to speak. And I did not speak it well, but George spoke it beautifully, and that was an important component of all this.
Well, and to this day, one of the stories we use, we talk about narratives and credibility and trust. To this day, one of the stories we tell is that the project was debt free.
Yeah.
That we didn't end up in any debt from the project, and people always are like, shocked by that.
Yeah.
It's
How did that
jaw-dropping.
happen?
Yeah. How did you do that? And
No line of credit either.
yeah, and that today, even though the current operations and organization aren't directly connected to all the individuals that were involved in that project, because there was so much accountability and because there was so much specificity in how that all went down, it then gave us a level of credibility. When we talk to somebody, they're like, oh wow, I mean, if you all could pull off that without any debt, that's amazing.
So Jeff, that's for one of your future podcasts, not part 2 of this one, but maybe down the road, is how does coming through a tough project like that create a DNA that prepares an organization to live through COVID or some other challenge? And so how does that implant of that DNA help organizational culture for future?
And I think it did give us actually a lot. I mean, it was also devastating to also lose having people in that space during that period, but we also wanted to fight for it.
One year after we opened, right? We've been open thanks to
Thank goodness we got a year.
Yeah, I'm really glad everybody got a year in that space. Well, y'all, thank you so much for this. It means a ton, and also just great to get the band back together.
Yeah,
again,
that was great.
Lack of way of saying it, but thank you all so much.
All right,
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it.